What happens when a racist man tries to remove a black woman from a luxury gym, only to find out she owns the entire community? At Verona Heights, an exclusive residential community, Serena Walker is enjoying a morning workout when Daniel Whitmore, a longtime resident, assumes she doesn't belong. Fueled by entitlement, he calls security to have her removed. But what he doesn't know, Serena is the sole owner of Verona Heights. When the truth is revealed, justice is served and power shifts in the most poetic way possible. Stay tuned for a powerful story about prejudice, karma, and the downfall of arrogance. Subscribe to Black Stories for more eye-opening tales that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. The soft hum of treadmills and the rhythmic clanking of weights filled the spacious, state-of-the-art gym at Verona Heights, a luxurious residential community built for the elite. The scent of freshly cleaned equipment mixed with the faint aroma of citrus-scented disinfectant in the air. Large floor-to-ceiling windows lined one side of the room, offering a stunning view of the beautifully manicured gardens and infinity pool beyond. Serena Walker loved this place, not just because of its pristine facilities, but because she owned it. Every weight rack, every treadmill, every polished tile, it all existed because of her vision and determination. Dressed in sleek black athletic leggings and a fitted tank top, Serena jogged on one of the high-end treadmills, maintaining a steady pace. Her toned arms moved in perfect rhythm with her strides, her breathing even and controlled. She wasn't just here to exercise. This was a rare moment of relaxation, a chance to clear her mind before another busy day of meetings and negotiations. Yet, as always, peace was never guaranteed. From the corner of her eye, she noticed him. Standing near the dumbbell rack was a man in his mid-50s, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, a permanent scowl etched into his face. He wore a sweat-stained gray tank top that clung unflatteringly to his slightly bloated frame, his muscular arms softened by age. Daniel Whitmore. Serena knew his type well, the old guard. The kind of man who believed places like this were meant for people like him, and only people like him. She had encountered men like Daniel her entire life. Men who would rather assume she was trespassing than believe she had the wealth and power to own a place like this. She saw the moment he locked eyes on her, his thin lips pressing into a firm line. His eyes flickered with disapproval, suspicion, entitlement. Here we go. Daniel walked straight toward her, his sandals slapping loudly against the polished floor, his movements stiff with barely restrained hostility. Serena kept running, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his presence looming closer. Finally, he stopped beside her treadmill, his arms folded across his chest. He cleared his throat, a pointed attempt to get her attention. Serena sighed inwardly. She had hoped for just one morning without having to deal with this type of nonsense. Still, she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of rattling her. She slowed the treadmill down to a brisk walk and turned her head slightly toward him, raising a single brow. "Something I can help you with?" she asked, her tone casual but firm. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping over her like he was assessing a stranger invading his home. "Yeah, I was just wondering, what are you doing here?" Serena blinked, pretending to be confused. "Exercising." "I can see that," Daniel said, his voice laced with irritation. "What I mean is, how did you get in here?" Serena stared at him for a beat, letting the question hang in the air. She could already tell where this was going, but she wanted to hear him say it. "Through the front doors," she answered smoothly, turning her attention back to the treadmill screen as if she were already bored of the conversation. That wasn't the answer Daniel wanted. His expression tightened, frustration creeping into his voice. "Look, I know every single resident here. I've lived in Verona Heights for 15 years and I don't recall ever seeing you before." Ah, there it was. Serena bit back a smirk. He really thought he had some kind of authority here. She slowed the treadmill even more and finally stepped off, grabbing her towel from the handlebar. Turning to face him fully, she dabbed the sweat from her forehead with an air of unbothered grace. "Well, I guess that makes sense," she said lightly. "Since I don't spend my time memorizing the faces of every resident here." Daniel's frown deepened. He didn't like that response, not one bit. "I'm just saying," he continued, "this is a private facility, for residents only." Serena tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "And you think I'm what? A random stranger who just wandered in?" Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose. "I think you should show me your key fob." Serena stared at him for a long moment. The audacity was almost amusing. "You want me to prove I belong here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes." Serena let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. "And who exactly appointed you as security?" Daniel's face flushed, his pride stung. "Listen, lady, Serena," she corrected. "My name is Serena." "I don't care what your name is," he snapped. "I just know you don't live here." Serena could feel the tension in the room now. A few other gym goers had subtly paused their workouts, glancing in their direction. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed curious to see how this would play out. Serena took a slow step forward, her posture relaxed but unshakably confident. "And why exactly do you think that?" she asked. "What about me makes you so sure I don't belong here?" Daniel opened his mouth, then hesitated. For the first time, he looked unsure. Serena leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to force him to listen. "Is it because you've never seen me before? Or is it because you don't think someone like me could live in a place like this?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He had no good answer. He could either admit his racism outright or backpedal. He chose the latter. "That's not what I said." "No," Serena lifted a brow. "Because that's exactly what it sounded like." Daniel took a half step back, his confidence wavering. He could feel the eyes of the room on him now. This wasn't going the way he had planned. Serena didn't look intimidated. She looked entertained. But Daniel wasn't ready to let this go, not yet. With a huff, he pulled out his phone. "You know what? I don't have time for this. I'm calling security. They'll sort this out." Serena sighed, shaking her head as he dialed the number. "Here we go again." She grabbed her water bottle, taking a slow sip as Daniel spoke into the phone, his voice dripping with self-righteous authority. "Yeah, I'm at the gym in Verona Heights. We've got a situation. There's a woman here, black. I don't think she lives here." Serena closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose. She had expected this. But what he hadn't expected, what he never even considered, was the truth that was about to hit him like a freight train. She smiled to herself, already knowing how this would end, and he had no idea what was coming. The tension in the air thickened like an approaching storm. Daniel's fingers curled around his phone as he ended the call, his chest puffed out with self-importance. He truly believed he was in control of the situation, that with a single call, he could have Serena removed, like she was some intruder who had dared to step foot in his domain. But Serena Walker wasn't one to be intimidated. She stood there, her expression unreadable, sipping from her water bottle as if this entire interaction was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. She had dealt with men like him before, men who confused privilege with power, men who believed that authority was something they were born with, not something earned. Daniel's eyes darted toward the entrance of the gym, clearly expecting security to barge in at any second and prove him right. When no one arrived immediately, his impatience grew. "You're making a mistake by not leaving now," he said, voice thick with frustration. "Security is on their way, and when they get here, you're gonna wish you had just walked out quietly." Serena let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "Walked out of where?" she asked, arching a brow. I belong here just as much as you do." Daniel scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "I doubt that." Serena sighed, wiping the sweat from her forehead with her towel. "You've been here for 15 years, huh?" she mused. "And that automatically makes you the gatekeeper of Verona Heights." Daniel straightened his back. "It means I know who lives here and who doesn't." "Oh, really?" Serena smirked. "You know all 300 residents personally?" Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Serena to catch. He faltered before quickly doubling down. "I know enough to know that you're not one of them." Serena's smirk widened. She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice just enough to make him listen. "And what exactly makes you so sure of that?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then paused, his lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time, he hesitated. Serena tilted her head, watching him carefully. She could see the battle playing out in his mind. He wanted to say it. He wanted to say that she didn't belong because she was black, because the image in his head of the people who lived in luxury communities like this didn't include women like her. But saying it out loud, that would expose him. That would be admitting what he was really thinking. So instead, he tried to dance around it. "You just don't look like the type of person who lives here." There it was. Serena let out a low laugh, shaking her head. "You mean I don't look like you?" Daniel bristled. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." The subtle hum of the gym seemed to fade as other residents pretended not to listen, but their ears were undoubtedly tuned in. A woman on the elliptical machine stole a glance their way before quickly looking back at her screen. A man stretching on the mats paused for a second too long, clearly catching every word. Daniel noticed the growing attention, and it only fueled his need to assert dominance. "Listen, lady." "Serena," she corrected smoothly. "I don't care what your name is," he snapped. "I don't need to explain myself to you. This is a private facility, and if you can't prove that you live here, then you need to get out." Serena crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "And what happens if I don't?" Daniel's eyes darkened. He took a step closer, his voice lowering into something dangerous. "Then I'll make sure you do." For the first time, Serena felt her body tense, not in fear, but in recognition. She had seen this shift before, that moment when men like Daniel ran out of words and resorted to force. When they believed that intimidation would do what logic couldn't. For a second, Daniel actually believed she might back down. Instead, Serena took a slow, deliberate step toward him, closing the distance just enough to let him know she wasn't intimidated. "You really think that's a good idea?" she asked, her voice level, her eyes locked onto his. Daniel swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly, but he didn't move. The power dynamic had shifted. A muscle ticked in his jaw, but before he could respond, the doors to the gym finally swung open. Two uniformed security guards entered, their gazes immediately snapping toward the scene in front of them. One of them, a tall, fit man with cropped brown hair, walked forward. "Mr. Whitmore, what seems to be the problem?" Daniel exhaled sharply, relief flooding his face as he turned to the guards. "Finally! This woman is trespassing. She doesn't live here and she refuses to leave." The guard shifted his gaze to Serena, his expression neutral. "Ma'am, do you have a resident key fob?" Serena didn't flinch. She didn't move to grab her ID. She didn't even blink. Instead, she crossed her arms and asked, "Am I being detained?" The guard hesitated. No, ma'am. We just need to confirm. Then I don't have to show you anything." Daniel's face turned a deep shade of red. "You see that? She's refusing. That proves she doesn't belong here." The guards exchanged a glance, sensing the growing hostility. One of them turned back to Serena. "Ma'am, we just need some form of confirmation." Serena took out her phone, scrolling casually as she spoke. "I don't think I'm the one who needs to prove anything here." She tapped the screen a few times before finally turning it around, holding it up for them to see. The guards leaned in, reading the official document on the screen. Their eyes widened. Daniel, still fuming, folded his arms. "Well," he demanded. "Aren't you going to escort her out?" The lead guard slowly turned back to him. "Mr. Whitmore," he hesitated, glancing at Serena for confirmation before continuing. "This is the owner of Verona Heights." Silence. Daniel's breath hitched. His eyes flickered from the security guards back to Serena, who now stood with an infuriatingly calm smile on her lips. His world was tilting. "What?" he croaked. Serena locked eyes with him, her voice smooth as silk. "I don't just live here, Mr. Whitmore." She paused, letting the moment sink in. Then, with a smirk, "I own this entire community." Daniel's entire face drained of color. The guards took a subtle step back, wanting no part in the humiliation that was about to unfold. And Serena. She was just getting started. The silence that followed Serena's revelation felt thick, almost suffocating. Daniel Whitmore stood frozen, his face drained of color, his mind struggling to process the impossibility of what he had just heard. Serena Walker, this black woman he had so confidently accused of trespassing, wasn't just a resident. She was the owner of Verona Heights, and yet, despite the truth now laid bare, Daniel's ego refused to accept it. A part of him still believed this had to be some kind of trick. A lie. A misunderstanding, because if it was true, that meant he had no power here. And that was something he simply couldn't stomach. His fingers twitched at his sides, his breath coming in short, sharp exhales. He couldn't let her win. And so, in a final act of desperation, Daniel did what men like him always did when their false sense of superiority was challenged. He reached for his last line of defense. He pulled out his phone. Serena, watching the movement with an unimpressed expression, sighed. She had seen this play out too many times before. Daniel's fingers flew across his screen as he dialed, his entire body radiating anger. He turned slightly away from her, speaking into the phone with an air of self-righteous urgency. "Yeah, this is Daniel Whitmore," he said loudly. "We've got a situation at the gym. There's a woman here who's refusing to identify herself, and I don't think she lives here. I need you to send security over immediately." Serena exhaled, shaking her head. She knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about following the rules. It wasn't about safety. This was about power. A white man's ability to summon authority with a phone call to reinforce his worldview. To weaponize security against a black woman simply existing in a space he didn't believe she belonged. Daniel didn't just want her gone. He wanted to humiliate her in the process. But what he didn't realize was that he was digging his own grave with every word. Serena didn't bother interrupting. She didn't argue. She just waited, because she knew exactly how this was going to end. The gym doors swung open with force and two uniformed security officers strode inside. Their radios crackled softly at their sides, their black boots echoing against the polished floor. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Some residents who had been casually eavesdropping quickly turned away, suddenly very focused on their workouts. Daniel's chest puffed out as they approached. He turned to face them, his voice loud and commanding. "Officers, right here." "She's the one." One of the security officers, a tall, burly man with a square jaw and a shaved head, glanced between Daniel and Serena, his expression unreadable. The second officer, a younger man with sharp features and dark blonde hair, surveyed the scene with a bit more caution. Daniel gestured toward Serena as if presenting evidence. "I caught her sneaking in here. She refuses to show ID, and I know for a fact she doesn't live here." Serena could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but she didn't flinch. The older officer cleared his throat, then turned to Serena with a neutral expression. "Ma'am, may we see your resident ID, please?" Serena met his gaze evenly. Am I being detained? The younger officer blinked. Daniel looked furious. What? Daniel snapped. This isn't an interrogation, just show them your ID and leave already. The older officer, clearly caught off guard by the shift in tone, hesitated. No, ma'am, you're not being detained, he admitted. But if you could just show us proof that you live here, we can clear this up quickly. Serena tilted her head slightly, a knowing smirk playing at the corner of her lips. And if I say no? Daniel let out an exasperated laugh, throwing his hands in the air. See, she's being difficult on purpose. You hear that right, she's refusing. That proves she doesn't belong here. Serena remained silent, watching the way Daniel's anger curdled into desperation. Because deep down he knew something was wrong. This wasn't playing out the way he had imagined. He had expected security to side with him immediately, to drag Serena out without question. But instead they were hesitating, watching her, waiting, because something wasn't adding up. Serena's demeanor was too calm, too composed. She wasn't acting like someone who had been caught trespassing. She wasn't scrambling to defend herself. She was watching, waiting, like she knew something they didn't. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his confidence faltering. Well, he demanded, turning back to the officers. Are you going to do something or not? The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner, as if silently asking the same question. Finally, the younger officer turned to Serena again, his voice more measured. Ma'am, is there a reason you don't want to show us your ID? Serena smiled. Finally. They were asking the right questions. She reached into the pocket of her leggings, pulling out her phone. Daniel let out a triumphant scoff. See, she was lying this whole time. Serena tapped her screen a few times, then turned the phone around for the officers to see. The two men leaned in. Their eyes widened. Daniel, still smirking, took a step closer, trying to catch a glimpse. But before he could, the older officer turned to him, his entire demeanor shifting. Mr. Whitmore, he said carefully, I think we need to have a word. Daniel frowned. What? Why? Just kick her out already. Serena let out a soft, amused hum. Maybe you should let them raid the screen first. Daniel scowled but glanced down, and then he stopped breathing. His smirk vanished. His face turned an ugly shade of red, then pale. On the screen, displayed in bold, undeniable letters, was an official ownership document for Verona Heights. And right at the top, Serena Walker's name, the owner of the entire community. Daniel's throat clicked as he swallowed, his lips parting in stunned disbelief. No, he muttered. That's not possible. Serena arched a brow, slipping the phone back into her pocket. I don't just live here, Mr. Whitmore. She took a slow step forward, letting the words sink in like a blade. I own every single building in this community. Daniel stumbled back slightly, his world crashing down around him. The security officers looked deeply uncomfortable now, shifting awkwardly as they realized they had just been used in an attempted racial profiling incident. The older officer cleared his throat again, straightening. Mr. Whitmore, it appears there's no issue here. Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Serena smiled, tipping her water bottle toward him in a mock toast. Nice try, though. And with that, she turned back toward her treadmill, unfazed. Because this wasn't new, and Daniel Whitmore, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. For a long, drawn-out second, the gym was silent. Daniel Whitmore stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling with quick, uneven breaths. Everything he had been so sure of, everything he had believed, was now unraveling right in front of him. He had called security, expecting them to handle the situation swiftly, to remove Serena like she was some unwanted trespasser in his pristine, whitewashed world. Instead, they were looking at him now, and they did not look pleased. The older security officer cleared his throat. His previously neutral expression had shifted, not to hostility, but to something close to discomfort. like he had just realized he had been dragged into something ugly. He exchanged a glance with his younger partner before turning back to Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, like he was about to break bad news to a child. "It appears there's been a misunderstanding." Daniel's body tensed. "What? What the hell are you talking about?" Serena, still standing calmly, let out a quiet hum of amusement. She tucked her phone away, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. "I don't just live here, Mr. Whitmore," she repeated, enunciating each word with deliberate ease. Daniel felt his pulse slam against his throat. "I own every single building in this community." A few residents, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, audibly sucked in a breath. Someone near the dumbbell rack shifted awkwardly, suddenly hyper-aware of the confrontation unfolding before them. Daniel staggered back slightly, his mind scrambling for something, anything, to contradict her. That's not possible." His voice cracked slightly. You're lying." Serena arched a brow. "Am I?" She pulled her phone back out, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward him again. This time he forced himself to look. And there it was, a legally binding property deed for Verona Heights. Serena Walker's name was printed boldly at the top, her title as the sole owner and chief investor unmistakable. Daniel's world tilted. His breathing became erratic, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. He had lived in Verona Heights for 15 years. He had paid his HOA fees, his property dues, his taxes. He had sat in every committee meeting, shaken hands with board members, acted as though he had some unspoken authority over this place. And yet, the entire time it was owned by her, a black woman. Daniel's skin flushed a deep, humiliated red. His throat tightened as his gaze darted around the gym, suddenly hyper-aware of how many people were watching. Because they were watching. Residents who had once ignored the scene were now very interested in what was unfolding. A young woman on a treadmill had subtly removed her AirPods, her gaze flicking back and forth between Serena and Daniel, like she was watching a live courtroom drama. An older man doing seated dumbbell presses had stopped mid-rep, his lips pursed in clear intrigue. Even the front desk attendant, who had been scrolling on his phone minutes ago, was now fully alert, his brows raised. Daniel felt sick. And Serena? She looked completely unbothered. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly as she examined Daniel like he was a particularly pathetic case study in arrogance and self-sabotage. "So let me get this straight," she mused. "You were so convinced that I didn't belong here that you called security on the owner of this entire community." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't know." "You didn't think," Serena corrected smoothly. "You assumed." She took a slow step forward, and for the first time, Daniel took a step back. He had started this interaction with the full confidence of a man who believed the world bent to his will. Now, he looked cornered. Serena let the silence stretch for a beat longer, then shook her head with a soft laugh. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "If anyone doesn't belong here, wouldn't it be you?" The words landed like a gunshot in the dead of night. Daniel's entire body locked up. He could feel the weight of every single pair of eyes in the gym pressing down on him. The humiliation was crippling. Serena turned to the security officers, her expression cool and composed. "Gentlemen, do I need to call corporate security to handle this situation?" The younger officer immediately shook his head. "No, ma'am. There's no issue here." The older officer, who had previously seemed skeptical, now straightened his posture and gave a curt nod of acknowledgement. "Apologies for the inconvenience, Miss Walker." Daniel snapped his head toward them, his voice rising. "That's it. You're just going to let her get away with this." The older officer's jaw tightened slightly. He had realized, too late, that he had been manipulated into enforcing something far more insidious than a security concern. and he wasn't about to let it go any further. He took a step toward Daniel, his voice clipped. "Mr. Whitmore, I'd advise you to leave this gym before you embarrass yourself any further." Daniel's nostrils flared. His hands curled into fists. He wanted to fight this. He wanted to deny it, to argue, to twist reality back into a version that made sense to him. But he couldn't, because there was no way out of this, not anymore. Serena smiled, stepping back toward the treadmill. "Oh, and Mr. Whitmore." He didn't respond. He couldn't. Serena's smile turned sharper. "Since you seem to have so much time to patrol my property, I'd suggest using it wisely." She picked up her towel, draped it over her shoulder, and returned to her treadmill like he was nothing more than a brief inconvenience in her day. Because that's exactly what he was. A minor, predictable inconvenience. And that was the final blow. Daniel stumbled back, his face burning with rage and humiliation, before storming out of the gym. And the second the doors closed behind him, a low, satisfied chuckle rippled through the room, because everyone had just witnessed a masterclass in poetic justice. The automatic doors to the gym slammed shut behind Daniel Whitmore as he stormed out, his face flushed with a mix of rage and humiliation. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembled. He could still feel the stares of the gym goers burning into his back, their silent judgment louder than any words. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected to assert his authority, to have security escort her out, proving that people like her didn't belong in places like this. But instead, he had been the fool. No, worse than that. He had been publicly humiliated. And he refused to let it end like this. Daniel stormed across the pristine lobby of Verona Heights, his footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floors. He shoved past a young receptionist at the front desk, heading straight toward the HOA office. "I want to file a formal complaint," he barked. The receptionist, startled, blinked up at him. Sir, what exactly?" "Serena Walker," he snapped. "She just threatened me in the gym. She's trying to push me out of my own home. I've lived here for 15 years and I have rights." The young woman, clearly caught off guard, hesitated before giving him a polite but very professional smile. "Miss Walker is the owner of Verona Heights, sir." Daniel clenched his jaw. "I don't care if she owns half the damn city. I pay my HOA fees. I have a right to be here." The receptionist gave him a careful look. "I'm afraid any disputes will have to be handled through the board, sir." Daniel gritted his teeth. He knew she was right. Verona Heights was private property, and while residents had leases, those leases were subject to review and renewal. And who had final say over those renewals? Serena Walker. His stomach twisted. He had to do something. That night, Daniel wrote a long, furious email to the HOA board, listing every reason he believed Serena Walker was unfit to own the community. He accused her of being hostile, unprofessional, and unqualified. He claimed she had used her position unfairly, that she had disrespected a long-term resident. And then, because he couldn't help himself, he implied, just subtly, that maybe Serena's background wasn't quite right for a place like Verona Heights. It was coded language, but he knew people like him would understand. Satisfied, he hit send. The next morning, Daniel woke to an email notification from the HOA board. He smirked, confident that his complaint had been heard. But when he opened it, his smirk vanished instantly. The message was brief, professional, and absolutely devastating. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, after reviewing the recent incident and your history within the Verona Heights community, we regret to inform you that your lease renewal has been declined. Your residency at Verona Heights will conclude at the end of your current lease term. Additionally, due to formal complaints filed regarding instances of harassment and racial profiling, you are required to attend an exit interview with the HOA board. We appreciate your cooperation in making this transition smooth. Regards, Verona Heights HOA Board. Daniel stared at the screen, his vision blurring. He read the words over and over again, hoping, praying that he had misread something. But no, it was all there. His lease renewal had been denied. He was being forced to leave. He had lost. Daniel sat motionless at his dining table, his hands clenched into tight fists. How had this happened? How had everything flipped on him so quickly? A sharp knock at his door startled him out of his thoughts. He hesitated before getting up, feeling an uneasy sense of dread. When he opened it, he found Serena Walker standing there, arms crossed, an undeniable air of authority radiating from her. Daniel's stomach churned. "Enjoying your morning?" she asked smoothly. Daniel's face twisted in anger. "You can't do this. I have a right to live here." Serena sighed, shaking her head. "You still don't get it, do you?" She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. A second later, Daniel's own email appeared on her screen. She had received the complaint. And she hadn't even bothered to respond. She had just silently shut him down. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You spent 15 years believing you were the one who decided who belonged here, but it turns out you were wrong." Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. "This is my home." Serena's lips curled into a cold smile. "Not anymore." Daniel sucked in a sharp breath, his world crumbling around him. Serena took a step back, her work here done. "Pack your things," she said, turning to leave. "Your time is up." And with that, she walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, broken, humiliated, and very, very alone. 2 months later, Verona Heights had never looked better. New policies were put in place to ensure that no resident, regardless of race, gender, or background, would ever have to endure what Serena had faced. More families moved in. The community thrived, embracing diversity and leaving behind the remnants of people like Daniel Whitmore. And Daniel, he moved away quietly, without the fanfare he had once expected. No one fought for him to stay. No one missed him when he left. Because, in the end, he had proven one universal truth: racism has no place where power is held by those determined to dismantle it.